Bouskila. Oh.
Yeah, I'm muted. You can hear me now, everyone? Okay, fantastic. Well, good morning, everyone. Greetings from a very wintry Jerusalem. It's not quite Texas, but it is snowing outside. Yes, it is. It wasn't just yesterday. In the north, in the Golan Heights, it's snowing a lot. You could check the news afterwards and you'll see, but very pretty outside. It's cold, very, very cold. It's a storm that's came in sometime Tuesday night and into Israel and hit Jerusalem today with a lot of wind. And then the snow started maybe about 3 hours ago. So it's kind of cool. It's a different, it's not the warm Middle East that we're used to, but it'll only last a few days and the weather will already get beautiful probably around Shabbat or Sunday. So it's a pleasure to be with you again from Israel. And I want to continue the journey that we started last week, talking about Sephardic Judaism, Sephardic history, Sephardic intellectual history, philosophy, as much as we can get into an hour and allowing time for some comments and questions. What I'd like to do today, last week I gave you a lot of overview, and I want to get a little bit more specific today, but what I'd like to do, I generally don't, I don't love putting texts up on Zoom. I think it kind of gets distracting and we don't get a chance to interact and see each other. And I also typically don't read from any materials when I teach. I usually just, enjoy teaching. Sometimes I have texts if if it's a text-based class, but here, jumping from topic to topic, I prefer having the conversation with you. But I will, in this case, not put something up on the screen, but I'd like to read something to you. This is a short paragraph. It's the introduction to a book written by a colleague of mine, a friend, a professor here, Bar-Ilan University. He's also a longtime fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. His name is Professor Tzvi Zohar. He's originally from the United States, but he's been living in Israel for many, many years. And he is a preeminent scholar in the Department of Law at Bar-Ilan University. I think he's already Professor Emeritus. And he has particular expertise in the writings, the legal halachic writings and philosophy of the Sephardic rabbis of the Middle East and North Africa from the 19th and 20th century. And he's written many articles and books, and eventually I will get to the 19th and 20th century so that we can also talk about what happened in the aftermath of the expulsion from Spain and where the Sephardic Jews went and their influence in the Middle East and North Africa and the definitions and so on. But what I'd like to do is to begin by reading just a short paragraph from the introduction to a book that he wrote in Hebrew many, many years ago. I believe it was part of his doctoral dissertation. It was then published as an expanded book. And then recently, a portion of it was published in English. It's titled Rabbinic Creativity in the Modern Middle East. And just to tell you a little bit about the book, it demonstrates the fact that, as I mentioned last week, North American Jewry automatically thinks in denominational terms, which is really, in the long history of Judaism, a phenomenon that's about 150 years old at most, okay? Whether you talk about Rashi, who lived in France and Germany, or you talk about Maimonides, who lived born in Spain and then lived in Morocco and then in Egypt, and neither of them heard of the term Orthodox, and neither of them it is inappropriate to refer to any of them as Orthodox rabbis. Maybe in the denominational context of saying, well, they were more observant of Jewish law than a Reformed Jew, so therefore they're Orthodox. Again, that's a conversation that not only is it inappropriate to call Maimonides or Rashi, I'm just using those as examples, as famous examples, or the Kabbalists of the city of Tzfat, to use the terms Orthodox, certainly not conservative or Reform. There was no such division, there was no such denominations. Those were born sometime in the late 18th or 19th century in Germany and were imported to the United States. As I mentioned last week, I think in this class, I mentioned that those denominations have not taken hold in Israel here. While they do exist in small pockets, certainly Sephardic Jews don't refer to themselves in those terms. If a Sephardic Jew happens to drive on Shabbat or go to the soccer game on Shabbat, they don't necessarily call themselves conservative. And if a Sephardic Jew happens to have left the fold altogether and doesn't observe anything, including Yom Kippur, they don't call themselves Reform. And if Sephardic Jews observe Jewish law and keep Shabbat, they don't call themselves Orthodox. Those terms have come into Israeli parlance in some places. Well, they'll use the term, and there's no Hebrew term for it. So if they say Reform Jew, they'll say Reformi. If they say Orthodox Jew, they'll say Orthodoxy. Wonderful, brilliant rabbi, family from Iraq. He's a brilliant scholar of halakha, of Jewish philosophy. He's also a musician who plays the oud. He's a paitan. He's a singer of the beautiful piyutim, the Sephardic liturgical music. And he quotes, which is the point of Tzvi Zohar's book and of many other writings, which I will be mentioning over the next few weeks. He speaks of the fact that when I quote, it happens to me too, when we quote many of the Sephardic rabbis from the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century on many issues in Jewish law, conversion to Judaism, women's place in the synagogue in Judaism, or their role, and so on and so forth, the opinions sound so modern and so progressive that they often ask us, they say, but aren't you an Orthodox rabbi? How are you quoting all these positions that sound very progressive and very liberal? And so he put up a post on Facebook a few years ago, and he said, the term in Hebrew for Orthodox is, again, it's not in Hebrew, but the pronunciation of it is, they say it's orthodoxy. Okay, so listen to the sound of it for a moment. It's very unappealing. Even the term Orthodox is a very frightening, unappealing term in Greek or in English or whatever language you use it in. But certainly when you say orthodoxy, it has kind of a strange sound to it. So he goes, anytime somebody asks me, am I orthodoxy? Haimani orthodoxy? He says, I have a feeling that when my grandfather came to Palestine from Iraq, and if somebody would have walked up to him and said, are you orthodoxy? He would have paused and said, no, I'm feeling fine, thanks. I'm good. It sounds like an illness. Are you orthodoxy? No, I don't have that condition. I was diagnosed, but I'm over it now, or something. These are foreign terms. We've never heard of these terms. Yet, unfortunately, North American Jewish life decided to define a 3,000 plus old tradition in 150-year-old terms. It's too bad, because there's a lot more beyond denominations. And Sephardic Judaism certainly has never measured itself or defined itself in that terminology. Indeed, let me now read to you from Tzvi Zohar's introduction to put things in context, not only in terms of denomination, but in terms of something that I mentioned last week when we spoke about the fact that clearly, when we spoke about narratives, and that the narrative of North American Jewry is what we will call an Ashkenazi narrative. It's an Ashkenormative narrative. I don't mean only in terms of pop culture. I don't mean only in terms of Fiddler on the Roof and Bagels and Lox and, the Yiddish and so on. I mean, even if you go to the university, okay? I'm so happy and impressed that Wilshire Boulevard Temple asked me to do this class, but in 4 sessions. Because I'll tell you how absurd it is when I've gotten telephone calls from professors at UCLA or Northridge or USC who are teaching a class called Introduction to 19th Century Jewish History. And they call me and they say, Rabbi Bouskila, can you come into my class and give 1 session on Sephardic Judaism? My answer always is, absolutely, if you can come in to my class and give 1 session on Ashkenazi Judaism. I mean, the absurdity of the idea of saying that you're going to take an entire tradition and wrap it up into a 45-minute or 1 hour class in the context of a university, right? That's supposed to teach, the breadth of Jewish history, Jewish knowledge. If you want to call it Introduction to Eastern European Jewish History, right? Then there's not even a need for the Sephardic place. If you're saying this is the introduction to Jewish history, this is what we're teaching. When we talk about rabbis, we're going to talk about Soloveitchik and Hirsch and Mendelssohn. We're not going to mention Uziel and Abu Kassis and I'm David Alevi. We're not going to mention those names. They don't know who they are, and it's really, really unfortunate. And it's the fact that things have not been fully studied by many of the historians. Here in Israel, it's very different, of course. If you were to Hebrew University or Bar Ilan University or Tel Aviv University, it's going to be a much more complete picture because this is a living and breathing Jewish society. It's not just ideas. And so all people's narratives, their literature, their poetry, their background, those are very much part of the curriculum. It was a problem in the early state of Israel when the curriculum was very Eastern European and Ashken normative, again, because most of the Zionists who founded Israel came from those countries. Things have changed, and they're changing more and more every day, rapidly, to bring things to a more equal place. It's not a question even of equality, it's just a question of completing the narrative, knowing the whole story. So let me read you this chapter to put things into historical perspective. This is from a professional historian. He writes, Tzvi Zohar, over the course of recent centuries, tremendous changes have taken place in human societies and cultures. Most of the accounts of these changes seem to have been written from a Eurocentric perspective. This is also true with regard to portrayals of the Jewish people and Judaism. For at least 2,000 years, from biblical times until the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, Jews and Judaism existed and developed in the Middle East, including toward the end of that period, lands in North Africa and Spain, ruled by and acculturated to a later Middle Eastern religious culture called Islam. Around the year 1000 of the Common Era, Jews were clearly a Middle Eastern and Mediterranean people, concentrated mainly in Islamic lands of the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain, but also in the territories of Christian Byzantium. Although Jewish cultural religious creativity began to flourish in northern France and the Rhineland, otherwise known as Ashkenaz, in the 11th century, it was not until 700 years later, sometime in the 18th century, that numerical parity was reached between the Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews of Central and Eastern Europe and the Arabic and Ladino-speaking Jews of the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. Thus, for 90% of their historical timeline, Jews and Judaism were completely or mostly Middle Eastern and Mediterranean. Yet today they are perceived by many, both Jews and non-Jews, as an Occidental people and culture, and their history and development are presented through Eurocentric eyes. This focus on European Jews and Judaism is especially striking with regards to accounts of the history and development of Jewish religion and culture in modern times. The course of Judaism and Jewish culture in modern times is often charted from the 18th century split between Hasidism and Misnagdim through the Jewish Enlightenment of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, thence to the appearance of the Reform movement around the year 1810 and the formation of its arch opponent, the Orthodox movement, thence to secularization, German Jewish philosophy, Jewish socialism like the Bund, Zionism, etc. The image of Judaism becomes that of the various Ashkenazi denominations, and the study of Jewish creativity in theology, philosophy, halacha, Jewish law, and Kabbalah becomes the study of works produced largely by Ashkenazi Jews, whether in Europe or in North America. So you understand that originally, for most of our existence as Jews, we were a Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, North African people, not a European, Eastern European, Yiddish-speaking, German-speaking people. That didn't come until much, much later. Indeed, Judaism's first encounter with the larger intellectual world beyond the confines of Rabbinic Talmudic Judaism happened in Spain, right? But not under Christian Spain, but under Muslim Spain, when the golden age of Spain that eventually flourished, of which today I'd like to speak a little bit about, right, happened under Islamic rule and culture, not under Christian rule and culture. The Islamic world was the last holdout of rationalism in the face of the dogma of Christianity. The Islamic world was the beacon of light, of rationalism and reason, blended with faith, right? Whereas the Christian world went into a sort of a dark, dogmatic period where all of intellect, science, mathematics, philosophy, and so on was not only not studied, but it was discouraged. It was considered indeed heretical to engage in that sort of study. In the Islamic world, it was encouraged, it flourished, and the preeminent figure of Judaism that represents the blend of all of those worlds, and for the very first time brought that to the world, is named Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, acronym Maimonides, Rambam, in Latin called Maimonides. Maimonides is not a product of European Judaism, he's a product of Islamic Judaism. His language was Arabic, he did not speak Hebrew, he did not speak Ladino. Those people who have some impression that the Jews of Spain all spoke Ladino, that's not something that came until much, much later. And Maimonides wrote many, many, many works, of which I want to speak about tonight. But his primary works, right, that were considered his most intellectual, philosophic works, like the Guide for the Perplexed, he specifically chose to write them not in Hebrew. His works of Jewish law, like the Mishneh Torah, his magnum opus, where he codified all of Talmudic law. He's the only Jew to have ever done that anywhere, right? When he codified all of Talmudic law, he did that in Hebrew because Hebrew is the language of Rabbinic Judaism, of Talmudic Judaism. But when he decided to write a book of philosophy, where he tried to blend Aristotelian and Neoplatonic thinking with Rabbinic Judaism, he wrote that in Arabic. Why is that? Because Arabic was the language of the intellectuals. And when you were appealing to intellectuals, you were going to speak to them in the highest language, and it was written in a very, very high-end literary Arabic. The same, by the way, with his commentary to the Mishnah being the 6 tractates, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. His very, very first commentary to that was written in Arabic. And there, throughout, right, and throughout his works, all of his works, there is this continued negation of what we would call a magical, mystical, superstitious Judaism, replaced instead with science, medicine, he was a physician as well, and rationalism. This was the world of Maimonides. The world of Maimonides was not amulets, it was not superstitions, it was not belief in, speaking to the dead and so on. He was not a Kabbalist at all. What we will find tonight, and what I will define for you tonight, is to take Tzvi Zohar's introduction and to backtrack it a little bit. If you were to talk to anybody who knows something, casually knows something about Jewish intellectual history, the texts of Judaism. I'm not a historian of Jewish genealogy. I have no idea. I don't even know if I went and did 23andMe, maybe my roots are Muslim for all I know, and my grandparents converted to Judaism. I have no idea, and I don't really care. I think that's the most irrelevant stupidity I've ever heard of, and it means nothing. Sephardic Judaism does not mean that you're born in Spain, just like Ashkenazi Judaism does not mean you're born in Germany. Sephardi and Ashkenazi Judaism were regional intellectual genres of Judaism. right? It's much like saying Ivy League doesn't mean you went to Harvard. It means you could have gone to any number of schools that are called the Ivy League. Along the same lines, the Sephardic intellectual, philosophical, and legal approach is something that perhaps had its origin in Spain. But let's not forget, some of the preeminent figures of Sephardic Judaism didn't live in Spain all that long. How old was Maimonides when he left Spain? 14. Yet he's one of the most influential Sephardic rabbis ever. He didn't live in Spain most of his life. He lived in Morocco, and then he lived in Egypt. So he was in Spain until he was a teenager, early teenager. The year after his bar mitzvah, his family left, never went back to Spain. Okay, let's fast forward a couple centuries later. The author of the most authoritative book of Jewish law, right, that the Jewish people follow as their authoritative work of law, the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rav Yosef Karo. He was born in 1488 in Spain. What happened 4 years later, 1492? Bye-bye. The Jews were all expelled from Spain. So that means Rav Yosef Karo, who's considered to be one of the most preeminent Sfaradim, he lived only 4 years in Spain. You understand? So the business of saying who's Sephardic, are you born there, are you considered Sephardic because you speak Spanish or not, has nothing to do with it. I don't know anything about those things. And when people ask questions about Sephardic foods, that is purely culture. I mean, if you come here to Jerusalem, there's disputes about how to bake certain things, whether you live in the old city of Jerusalem or whether you live in the old city of Tzfat. Those are cultural things, okay? We can have arguments about what is Jewish food in general. What is Israeli food? Is there such a thing? Okay, is hummus Israeli or is it Arab? You know, the typical menu of an Israeli restaurant, what are most of those foods are Middle Eastern and North African and Arab foods that have become Jewish foods or Israeli foods, much like American food comes from all over the place. So I have no idea about those things, but what I do know one thing is that when I talk about some of the most influential genres of Judaism to have spread to the whole Jewish world, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, what I do know is this, that the two threads of intellectual Judaism that helped define Judaism for a good 1,000 years, what we will call rationalist intellectual Judaism, or what we will call Kabbalistic Judaism or mystical Judaism, we will all agree, no matter what background we come from, that the most influential trends in Jewish life were either the rationalist trend or the mystical trend. That is the natural split of Jewish communities who adopted a rationalism, a Judaism rooted in studying philosophy, an intellectual modern Judaism, or a mystical Judaism that's rooted not in actual reason and mathematics, but is rooted in mysticism. Both of those trends were born, nurtured, and developed in Spain. Both of those trends. If the golden age of Spain, if the expulsion from Spain, had not taken place, the Kabbalistic world that developed in the 16th century in Tzfat would not have been. It was a direct reaction to that. The Zohar, which is the preeminent classic work of Jewish mysticism, was composed in the 13th century in Spain by a Spanish rabbi named Moshe de Leon. 99% of the original scholars of Kabbalah and mysticism had names like Alcabetz and Cordovero and Caro and Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides, okay? Even the great, I mentioned him last week, the great founder of a messianic movement in Judaism, who came from Turkey, Shabtai Tzvi, okay? He too was a Kabbalist. He was a great Kabbalist. He was a brilliant Kabbalist who had very radical ideas and influenced a number of people to follow him as what ended up being an episode of false messianism, okay? On the other hand, if we move away from the mystical texts and we go to the rationalist texts, commentaries to the Bible, Ibn Ezra, Sforno, Nachmanides, Maimonides and his Guide for the Perplexed. All of these, again, were born or inspired from Spain. Abarbanel, Rabbi Daniel Bouskila, who was a great finance minister to the king and queen of Spain and became afterwards one of the great Bible commentators that are quoted. All of these people came out of the milieu of the Spanish, either Golden Age or the post-Golden Age birth of Kabbalistic and mystical Judaism. So it's important to understand that much of what we call the classic bulk of Jewish tradition, the bulk of the classic Jewish texts, the Bible, of course, is Middle Eastern. The Talmud was composed in Babylonia, okay? The majority of the Jewish legal texts, if we talk about halakha for a moment, Jewish law and its development, let's talk about some of the rabbis who actually wrote codes of Jewish law. I already mentioned Maimonides. Another one was Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. Alfasi means he came from Fez, right? From Morocco. And he was known as the Rif, right? Another one named the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, right? Rabbeinu Asher Bar Yechiel, who originally was born in Germany, but migrated to Spain and there flourished as a great scholar and a leader. So it's interesting, by the way, you should know that the Spanish community in Toledo, they didn't care that he was born in Germany, Rabbeinu Asher. It didn't matter to them. They didn't say he's not one of us because of his bloodlines. Judaism is not a religion of bloodlines. It's a religion of text lines. Judaism is not a religion that measures DNA. People who come and say, well, I took a test and I found the DNA that I'm a Kohen. Okay, that to me, that's Raiders of the Lost Ark Judaism. It's not real. It's pure fiction. And it actually, according to Jewish tradition, means nothing at all whatsoever. That's not how we've ever looked at Jewish tradition. If we did, most people who converted to Judaism wouldn't be considered Jewish because we'd say they don't have Jewish bloodlines. The very existence of conversion to Judaism, right, is that we don't care about those ideas. We're a religion of ideas and a religion of our texts and of the commentaries to our texts. So this is all really, really important to understand. And that's why, by the way, these Kabbalists and these rabbis who originally came from Spain, none of them came from Spain with the idea of Sephardic pride and so on and so forth. That's some silliness that developed much, much later. I don't know why, I don't know how, but in some sense, you know, people who felt maybe Sephardic Jews suddenly felt that their narrative was being crushed by a European Jewry based on like the introduction I read earlier. They started to, talk about, we're Sephardic Jews and we come from this tradition and we're the preeminent Jews and so on and so forth. But historically, classically, if we talk about Maimonides and the Golden Age of Spain, what characterized the Golden Age of Spain? When we use that term, what happened there? It was a flourishing of intellectual culture. For the very first time, Jews started to study grammar, science, philosophy, mathematics, and blend all of it with Judaism, blend all of it with Jewish texts, and to try to develop as much as possible a blend between their faith and large worldly culture. It's fascinating. I'll tell you something interesting. If you fast forward to the 19th century and you talk about Orthodox Judaism in the Ashkenazi German world, so who was one of the very first spokesmen? Orthodoxy was a reaction to reform, right? Where Judaism kind of became frozen in time and contracted and became orthodox. The free-flowing interpretation of Jewish law that was characteristic of Judaism for 1,500 years, especially by the rabbis who developed all of this. Yosef Karo and Maimonides, they were extremely creative in terms of their interpretation of every area and facet of Jewish law. When orthodoxy started to freeze, one of the very first inventors of what now is called modern Orthodox Judaism, right, was a rabbi named Hirsch, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch came up with an idea. He said, no, we don't believe in that orthodoxy, which now today the term would be ultra-Orthodoxy. This gets very confusing. There's too many labels, okay? Ultra-Orthodoxy, which rejected everything. Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodoxy is a rejectionist policy that has no room for any modern innovation. That means Reform Judaism was no good. What came to be known as conservative Judaism was no good. The Enlightenment was considered a tragedy. Zionism and the state of Israel, secular Jewish state, before the coming of the Messiah, and so on, all were considered out of bounds. And any engagement with the modern world was viewed as suspect. Hence, what Shalom Aleichem and later Broadway sort of fictionalized and idealized on stage for us in Fiddler on the Roof became a whole world in and of itself of, shtetls like Anatevka, who didn't want their people going to the big city. It was too threatening. They didn't want to have anything to do with the larger world as they knew it. They wanted to stay put in the small little shtetl. They didn't trust a non-Jew. They didn't want to have anything to do with the larger world. The larger world meant secularization. The larger world was a threat on their way of life. Came Hirsch with what he thought was an innovative idea. He called it Torah im derech eretz. Torah with, not derech eretz like good behavior, but derech eretz meaning with the way of the world. Later on, there was an institution that many of you may have heard of. I graduated from the institutions where I received my rabbinical degree. It's called Yeshiva University. In and of itself, sounds like a paradox. Is it a yeshiva or is it a university? How do those two exist on the same campus? How do those coexist? And how does a yeshiva have as its logo, the university's logo? Like if you look at Yale University, it'll say Urim V'Tumim. UCLA was like Veritas, all those Latin terms. What is Yeshiva University's logo if you look at it? Torah Umada, Torah and scientific knowledge. Well, guess what? Okay, 800 years earlier, somebody named Maimonides came up with that idea. And so did Ibn Ezra, and so did all sorts of the Sephardic rabbis, all of them. The golden age of Spain was all Torah Umada. The entire golden age of Spain was Jews engaging in the writing of poetry, whether it was religious liturgical poetry or poems that you could have read on Valentine's Day a couple of days ago, whether it was songs, meters, studying the Bible with grammar, blending the ideas of Aristotle and Plato into rabbinic texts. This is what the golden age of Spain was. Call it a grand intellectual university, where for the very, very first time, there was a meeting of cultures, okay? A couple hundred years later, okay, a new trend developed away from rationalism, more so in mysticism. This is what we came to know as Kabbalah. This too developed al Admat Sfarad, on the land of Spain, okay? So what's really important to understand is that the primary texts that represent the classic Jewish tradition for Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews all have their roots in the land of Spain. It doesn't mean that those texts only belong to Sephardic Jews. They belong to everybody. When Maimonides wrote his code of law, he didn't write it for Jews of Spain. He wasn't in Spain anymore. And he didn't write it for Sephardic Jews. He wrote it for Jews, okay? When the Kabbalah was written, none of them talked about being Sfaradim or Ashkenazim, even though the majority of them were Sfaradim. The one individual who was half-half in terms of his lineage and his parents was the famous Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, Lurianic Kabbalah, the Ari. He was born to an Ashkenazi father and a Sephardic mother, okay? And so he was of mixed heritage. It didn't matter to them. None of this really mattered to them. It started to matter much later when Judaism started to play ethnic politics and ethnic divisions. That exists here in Israel. It exists in the United States. who is a Jew? What is a Jew? Where are you from? Are you really Sephardic? If you're not Spanish speaking, you're not Sephardic, therefore you're Mizrahi, which is a fictitious term that has no place anywhere in a logically Jewish thinking world. None whatsoever. It's not a term that has any history or roots. Okay, Maimonides, when he arrived to Morocco, never called the Jews who were living there Mizrahi Jews. He didn't call them Sephardic Jews either. He called them Jews, right? And this is a very, very important piece to understand, that the classic Sephardic rabbis never viewed themselves or their students or their constituents in those terms. They wrote texts that they felt would affect not only the Jewish people, but would affect the world. When they wrote the Zohar, and when they wrote other Kabbalistic texts and started to practice Kabbalistic Judaism, what did they believe would happen? That they were preserving the Sephardic heritage from the golden age of Spain? No. They believed that by writing all this, they were going to bring in the Messianic age, right? Hence, Shabtai Tzvi took it to that level. But they didn't believe this whole idea of saying, let's preserve Sephardic culture. None of them were trying to preserve anything. They believed in what they wrote and were trying to promote it to the world at large in order to make a better world. What Maimonides used as the term tikkun olam, and what the Kabbalists used as the term tikkun olam, didn't mean social justice. It means bring the world to a higher intellectual or spiritual place. The term tikkun olam that you're familiar with was born in the mid-20th century as the term for social justice and going out and doing good things to help society and to repair the world and to translate it literally. Maimonides uses the term tikkun olam. What does he mean there? Through law and philosophy, I'm going to create a better world. I'm going to create a better world order. Law is going to create a more organized society, and philosophy is going to create a thinking and sensitive society. When the Kabbalists created the term tikkun olam, what did they mean? They said, we want to bring Jews back to Judaism. We believe that Jews who stopped observing the commandments have caused a retraction of God in the world. How do we bring God back into the world? By saying the Shema, by putting on tefillin, by keeping Shabbat. Those are the classic Kabbalistic ideas, right? And by the way, you should just, as an aside, for those of you who may have studied this, the Kabbalah that you hear of today, which is, some sort of a new age spiritual movement, has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with classic Kabbalah. None, zero. It's a complete perversion and fictitious understanding of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is not a global philosophy. It's a very Jewish philosophy. It's very limited to being pro-Jewish. It's only for Jews, according to its own texts, right? And its purpose in life is through Judaism and through a halachic Judaism of observing the commandments, bringing God back into the world and ultimately bringing in a better world, otherwise known as the Messianic age. Indeed, the push towards Messianism, and we want Mashiach, that comes in the form today of Chabad and many other Hasidic sects, all of that was created by whom? The Sephardic rabbis. Hasidic Judaism is nothing more than taking Kabbalistic Judaism and bringing it to their populations in Eastern Europe. It's all of the writings of Chabad or Satmar or all of the Hasidic groups are all based on classic Sephardic Kabbalistic texts that have their origins in Spain, and later on, after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, in places like Constantinople, and ultimately here in Israel, in Jerusalem partially, but primarily in the northern city of Tzfat. So this context that I'm trying to give you is that the Sephardic world, whether it was the classic golden age of Spain, of Maimonides and Ibn Ezra and Ibn Gabriel, or later on the mystical Jewish world of Nachmanides, or of Moshe de Leon, and then of the expulsion era in 1492, and what happened to that small community. It wasn't until, when we talk about the expulsion from Spain, We're not talking about 2 million people. We're talking about under 500,000 people, maybe under 300,000 people. It's a lot of people, but it's not, 6 million Jews of the Holocaust when some people want to compare and say the Sephardic Jews had the golden age of the expulsion from Spain, the Ashkenazi Jews had the Holocaust. Nothing to do one with the other, and numerically it's not the same. Bottom line speaking is that Judaism has never viewed itself in those terms. I'm going to tell you actually an interesting thing that happened. It's not only Ashkenazi Jewry that's at fault for creating this kind of, who's a purebred Sephardi, okay? Sephardic Jews are also at fault for that, primarily Ladino Sephardic Jews here in Jerusalem. And I'll tell you why. Because it was a custom for many, many Sephardic rabbis when they signed their name in Hebrew, they signed their name, they added 2 Hebrew letters afterwards with an acronym. The Hebrew letters were Samech Tet, okay? For somehow, nobody knows the origin of this, there's many theories. Some Sephardic Jews in the 19th century, Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews in the old city of Jerusalem, started to understand that acronym, Samech Tet, as meaning Sepharadi Tahor, pure Sephardi, meaning I'm purely a Sephardi. What did purely Sephardi mean? Did they do a DNA test? Is it because they spoke Spanish and not Arabic? Is it because they can trace their family name back to Spain and not to Syria or to Iraq? Whatever it meant, Samech Tet does not mean pure Sephardi. It's out of character for Jews. It sounds like the Nuremberg laws in Germany in 1933 to start talking about racial purity, Sepharadi Tahor. You know what Samech Tet originally meant? The opposite of the arrogance of saying I'm a pure Sephardi. The original Samech Tet, the acronym meant in Aramaic, sin v'tin. You know what that means? I am ashes and dust. Otherwise understood as saying, if I signed my name, Daniel Bouskila Samech Tet, that would mean Daniel Bouskila, your humble servant. It was a signature of humility, not a signature of arrogance or of elitism of saying this person is really Sephardic, this person is not. So even Sephardic Jews are part of the problem of having perpetuated these sorts of differences and divisions. It's us versus them. They're not really ours. This is not part of the original classic Judaism. Not in Germany, not in Spain. Were there disputes and differences of opinion on how to interpret Jewish texts? Definitely. Within Sephardic Jewry, there were differences. Within Ashkenazi Jewry, there were differences. And between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, there were differences. What's one of the best examples of that? Okay. When people ask me, what's the book that you could suggest? They always ask me, Rabbi Bouskila, can you suggest a good book that lays out the differences in Jewish law and customs between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews? I said, yes. The book is called the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. Why is that? Because what is the Shulchan Aruch? Who wrote it? Okay, the original Shulchan Aruch, which means the table is set, was written by a Kabbalist / legal mind named Yosef Caro, as I mentioned, born in 1488 in Spain. Family were expelled 1492 with the rest of the community. He went to Constantinople. There he had very mystical experiences with his friend Shlomo Alkabetz, who was the author of the poem that you sing every Friday night in synagogue. You all sing L'chadodi Likrat Kala when you go to Kabbalah Shabbat, right? Written in the 16th century in Tzfat by a Spanish Sephardic Jew named Shlomo Alkabetz. Shlomo Alkabetz and Yosef Caro were mystics. They had visions and voices that they heard telling them on the night of Shavuot one year that it's time to move to the land of Israel because only there they could sit and write their Kabbalistic commentaries and help bring the Messiah. Okay, so they went to Israel, and there, amongst other things, Yosef Caro, in addition to his many mystical writings, also wrote a codification of Jewish law based on 3 other books. He based himself on 3 previous Sephardic books, Maimonides, Rabbi Al-Fasi, who was the rabbi from Fez, and the Rabbeinu Asher, who was the rabbi who originally was born in Germany and then came to Spain later in his life and passed away in Spain. These were the three pillars of Jewish teaching. Yosef Karo read and studied all of their books, and from there he wrote a book called Shulchan Aruch. What does Shulchan Aruch means? The table is set. He wrote it in a way that was simple man's Judaism, right? No, you don't need to read the Talmud. You don't need to read commentaries. You don't need to do anything. You want to know how to put on tefillin in the morning? I'm going to teach you, okay? Otherwise known as, Judaism ABC. That's what the Shulchan Aruch is. Now, Yosef Karo wrote his Shulchan Aruch based on his interpretations as a Spanish, Constantinople, Mediterranean Jew who lived the majority of his life here in Israel, in Tzfat in northern Israel. And his work was accepted by largely the community that he had direct contact with, the Jews of the Mediterranean, the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, and the Jews of North Africa. In the meanwhile, somewhere in Europe, there was a rabbi named Moshe Isserlis, Rabbeinu Moshe Isserlis, known as Ramah. That's his acronym. He decided to do the exact same thing that Yosef Karo did. He was writing a book of Jewish law that he wanted to make simple for people to follow and to be a universally accepted book of Jewish law. Somehow they communicated, and somebody told Rabbeinu Moshe Isserlis in Germany, somebody told him, you know what? Your counterpart, who came from Spain and Constantinople and now lives in Tzfat, he's already writing a book like that. We don't need two of those books. So what did Rabbi Moshe Isserlis do? He said, well, if Rav Yosef Karo started to write that book, I'm going to let him finish it. And then I want a copy of it. And a copy of it came to him, and he went through it with a fine-tooth comb. It's a very long book, 4 large sections. He went through every single entry, and wherever he felt that there was a difference in opinion between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, or between himself and his counterpart in Tzfat, he wrote glosses to that. And you know what he named his book? Since Yosef Karo named the book the set table, the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserlis, named his book the Mapa, the tablecloth. Okay, it's cute, right? So you had the set table, and he said, I wrote the tablecloth. Now, when the printing press decided to print the book, they said, we want to print both of these books together as one. So essentially, when you have the Shulchan Aruch, you have 2 books. And how do you distinguish? Maybe next time I'll show you, I'll put it up on the screen for you to see. It's just a matter of fonts. We have 1 million fonts today with our computers. Well, those fonts started back in the day when the printing presses started. So they said, in order to differentiate, let's say we have an entry where Yosef Karo says something about, blowing the shofar, for example, right? How to blow the notes of the shofar. For example, okay, when you go to synagogue as Ashkenazi Jews on Rosh Hashanah and you hear somebody blowing the shofar, you have somebody call out the notes, don't you? They go, Tekiah, and you blow the shofar. Shvarim, the Sephardic Jews don't do that. The moment you make the blessing, right? Lishmoa kol shofar, and Shechianu Kimanu V'Yanu L'Manazeh, the person blowing the shofar is on his own and he just blows all of the notes. I've always said, the last couple of years I've been officiating in an Ashkenazi synagogue. I say it's really a lot easier to blow the shofar in an Ashkenazi synagogue than it is in a Sephardic synagogue. Because in Ashkenazi synagogue, you get to cheat. Every time the guy's saying Tekiah, Shvarim, you get to go and take a breather. Whereas when you're blowing the shofar in the Sephardic synagogue, there is no Tekiah, Shvarim. You're on for 5 minutes straight. And if you start running out of breath, everybody starts going, oh, what's going on? What happened? Whereas the Tekiah Shvarim caller, who's calling out the notes, he gives you that little breath. So I'm using that as an example because if Yosef Karo in his Shulchan Aruch said, blow the shofar straight through, and Rav Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, said, Ashkenazi, in our custom, Jews there's somebody calls out the notes. How do you see the differentiation in the text? So Yosef Karo's writing was written in block Hebrew print in the font, and the gloss of Rabbi Isserlis was written in kind of like a cursive font. So you were able to see two fonts. So essentially, when you see the Shulchan Aruch, what do you have? A book of two primary sources, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, blended into one. Now, the overwhelming majority of Jews, based on what I read to you in the beginning from Tzvi Zohar, over 80% of Jews at the time followed which book of the two? Yosef Karo's book. Because the majority of Jewry lived in the Middle East, the Iberian Peninsula, and North Africa. The Ashkenazi community was very small in number. It was very small in influence. So that means that the tablecloth book was only sort of what was a gloss, was an appendix to it. It wasn't considered the mainstream. Shulchan Aruch was. I want to give you, with our time remaining, and then I'll take a couple of questions or comments, I want to give you just one example of that will make sense to you. Probably many of you, and here I'm not going to use a complicated issue in Jewish law, I'm just going to give you the reality of what Judaism was and what it became. Many of you have probably had Sephardic friends invite you over on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. And they'll tell you, we Sephardic Jews do something very cool. We have a Rosh Hashanah Seder, the night of Rosh Hashanah, where we eat all sorts of foods. We eat dates, we eat leeks, we eat beets, pomegranates, all sorts of things. We put out this really beautiful platter. We don't just dip an apple in a honey. That's boring. We have a lot more, okay? A lot of people will look at that and go, oh, that's a very cool, exotic Sephardic custom of the Sephardic Jews, because the primary expression of Rosh Hashanah is dip the apple in the honey, right? As a matter of fact, if you walk into a store, in a Judaica store on Pico Boulevard or on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, sometime a month before Rosh Hashanah, and you want to buy somebody a gift to bring to their house for Rosh Hashanah, what will you find? Little holders of honey, holders of apple and honey. I've never seen anywhere a platter that says, here's a Seder plate for Rosh Hashanah with pomegranates and dates and all the other things that we put out there. Because the narrative in America is dip the apple in the honey. Let me give you the background of that for a moment, okay? Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch writes the following thing. On the night of Rosh Hashanah, for good luck, it's based on all sorts of plays on words that comes from the Talmud. Jews should eat the following thing: dates and pomegranates and beets and pumpkin or gourd. I remember there's 5 major things that they should eat. And here's what they should say. When they eat the date, they should say this. And when they eat the beets, they should say the following, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This that I just described to you was the custom of 80 to 90% of Jews that lived where they lived, which was the Middle East, North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula. Came Rav Moshe Isserlis from Germany and wrote, we in Germany have the custom of dipping an apple in a honey and saying, may you give us a sweet new year. Now, why did he write that? Was there some big disagreement between Yosef Karo and Isserlis? Did he have a philosophical or ideological problem with dates and pomegranates and gourds versus apples and honey? No. It's just that if you've ever been to Poland or Russia or Germany, it's kind of hard to get dates anytime, but certainly not in September, right? They're not available. Same with pomegranates, same with all of those Mediterranean fruits that are not going to be found in those cold climates in Poland. So he had to replace what was the original custom with something else instead. Now, what happened is because Ashkenazi Jewry became so predominant that the replacement became the thing to do. And when my family will do a seder that has all the original items, somebody will come and tell me, that's a very exotic, cool thing, but it's not. It's the original custom of Judaism. As a matter of fact, I tell all my Ashkenazi friends, if you lived where Moshe Israelites lived, in Germany or in Poland or in Russia or in all the German Franco lands, right? Then of course, the best you can do is get an apple and dip it in the honey, because you can't get dates and you can't get beets and you can't get all these other things. But man, we who live in Los Angeles, we have zero excuse not to go back to the original custom. You understand? Because there is nothing of that we can't get. Therefore, the custom should revert back. What I'm trying to say is that it's not a Sephardic custom. It was the custom of the Jewish people. The apple and the honey was just a little replacement because we can't get that food, right? So we decided to do something instead of. I promise you, if you brought Rav Moshe Israelis, who wrote that law, if you brought him to Los Angeles, to a market, if you took him to Valley Produce, or to Glattmart on Pico, or to one of the Persian markets, or even to Pavilions or Gelson's or Ralph's, and showed him what we've got in Los Angeles in terms of fruits and vegetables, he would say, who in the world is still doing only an apple and a honey? Are you out of your mind? You should be doing all of this. I only wrote this because our people couldn't get to those things, so we wanted to do something to feel like we were celebrating Rosh Hashanah the right way. So understand that these customs that became Sephardi and Ashkenazi customs were not meant to create differences or divisions. A lot of it was influenced simply on what region you lived in, what world, the pronunciation of things is not to create a difference between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. It's the fact that Sephardic Jews lived in Arab lands, so their Hebrew sounded more authentic, right? And was not influenced by German pronunciation, right? So, when you say Herzl, tsa, right? TZ, that's a German pronunciation. The letter tsa actually is pronounced like an S. It should be Herzl, that's a German pronunciation, okay? There are actually two letters that look different, but for some people who can't pronounce guttural Arab sounds, they sound the same, Aleph and Ayin, right? So I'm going to tell you a story. When I was a kid in school, we were learning Hebrew in Yavneh Hebrew Academy Day School in Los Angeles, California. And there, they taught us, they used to read blessings to us, like brachot, so that we would learn the blessing to wash our hands and over fruit and so on. And they would read it to us and we had to write it down. What we heard, we had to write down. So I came home with homework that I wrote down, the blessing. I showed my father, okay? And we wrote the blessing, Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, God, King of the universe. The word olam means world, universe, okay? My father noticed that in every place, because of the way the teacher pronounced, I wrote automatically the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, and I wrote olam with Aleph. Okay. So olam is spelled with ayin. It should actually be Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. So my father, when there was, my father went to the parent-teacher conferences and told the teacher, you're not pronouncing the difference between Aleph and ayin, right? And as a result, look what happened. So my father always told me the story that he said, had she said, look, I didn't grow up pronouncing that, so it's hard. It's difficult for me to do that. I'm sorry. I'll try to be more sensitive to it. It's one thing. But he said, the teacher said, what difference does it make? And so he said, I'll tell you what difference it makes. I'll show you what my son did. He heard you saying olam, not olam, so he wrote with Aleph. Now the difference between the word olam and olam, both of them are words. The difference is that when you say olam with ayin, the proper guttural pronunciation, it means universe. When you say olam with aleph, it means social hall, like where you get married in a social hall. So my father said, look what happened with the small change of a letter that you said doesn't make a difference. Theologically, God went from being the master of the universe to being the master of the social hall, right? You've reduced God from the global God to the God of, one room. So of course it makes a difference how we pronounce, right? So in certain countries, when, Maimonides speaking Arabic, of course, had no problem pronouncing that, right? Rashi speaking French and German, never heard of somebody saying Ein or Het. That's not how it sounded like. And that's not Arabic pronunciation. That's Middle Eastern pronunciation. And Hebrew is a Middle Eastern language. It was born in this region, not in Spain and not in Germany, but in Palestine and Israel and Iraq and in these countries. This is where the Hebrew language was born. So all of what I'm trying to point to is that these major differences that existed were not created to be differences. They were regional. For a long time, most of the Jews were indeed Middle Eastern, North African, and Iberian, okay? The Jews from Spain did not view themselves as some sort of cultural elite. On the contrary, they sought to spread their texts to the world. Yosef Karo with the Shulchan Aruch, the Kabbalists, the Zohar, Maimonides and his philosophic works. He didn't write these for Sephardic Jews. He wrote them for the Jewish people. Sephardi, Ashkenazi made no difference to him. Those differences, those artificial divisions came much, much, much later, okay? You take, for example, names. I think I told you the story of, if you go to Sephardic synagogues, there are people there who have Ladino Sephardic synagogues. There are people who have the last name Ashkenazi. Well, what are those people doing there? They shouldn't be there, according to those who want to talk about pure Sephardi, because why were those people named Ashkenazi? Because they came from Ashkenaz, they came from Germany, which means originally they were Ashkenazi Jews. They were born in Germany. And when they came to Spain, right, their name was Yitzchak HaAshkenazi, Isaac the Ashkenazi. He came from Germany. And the name stuck on and became part of the community, because for many, many, many years, there were Jews named Ashkenazi in the Turkish and Ladino community. So it became, by default, a Sephardic name, and those people adopted Sephardic customs and so on and so forth. So to kind of wrap it up for tonight, one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is to understand how deep the influence of Sephardic, of texts and ideas and laws that were born on Sephardic lands or were authored by Sephardic rabbis, how influential those texts have been to the Jewish experience. You don't have to be Sephardi to study Maimonides. You don't have to be Sephardi to study the Zohar or Kabbalistic texts. These texts were written by Sephardic Jews. These texts were nurtured and developed in Spain or by those who were thrown out of Spain and took their ideas elsewhere, to wherever they were welcome. They took their ideas to Morocco. They took their ideas to Turkey. They took their ideas here to Israel. They eventually took their ideas to the United States, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, right? But they were not there. They were not looking to only influence their communities. Much like when Rashi, who was born in Worms and lived in Germany and France, when he wrote his commentary to the Talmud or to the Torah, he wasn't writing it for German Jews. He was writing it for Jews. So it's very, very important to understand that. The differences, right? When we talk about next, one of the other things I want to do with you is I'm going to show you differences in liturgical genres. I'm going to give you some tastes and samples of what prayers sound like, okay? No two Sephardic synagogues are the same. If you go to a Moroccan synagogue, or if you go to an Iraqi synagogue, those are two completely different experiences. If you go to a Ladino synagogue, it's an altogether different experience. Much like when you go to different Ashkenazi synagogues, they don't all sound the same. They each have a particular genre or a particular repertoire of tunes that are based on particular regions where they prayed, how they were influenced, how their music came to be. So with that, I want to know if there's any, I don't know if I missed any questions in the chat or if there's any actual questions. Yeah, I see somebody asked about the structure of services between Sephardic and Ashkenazi and within how Turkish differs from Iraqi. So I'm going to say this very quickly, and I'll do a little bit more about liturgy next time, okay? If you take a Sephardic daily prayer book and an Ashkenazi daily prayer book, okay? They are, in terms of the text of the prayers, 98% identical, the exact same thing. Anybody who tells me when they come to a Sephardic synagogue, I couldn't follow, I said it's because you weren't looking in the prayer book. Okay, maybe you couldn't understand the pronunciation, but if you follow the prayer book, okay, the what we call the Psukei de Zimra in Ashkenazi terms, or the Zmirot, those are psalms that come from the book of Psalms. So they're not Sephardi or Ashkenazi. Ashrei or Hallelujah are the exact same in Sephardic and Ashkenazi. They may be chanted differently. That's just a cultural feature. Okay, the Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. It is what it is. Okay, whether you're Iraqi, Turkish, or Moroccan, or Lithuanian, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. One person might say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and other person might say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. That's a pronunciation difference. It's the same words. The Amidah or the Shemona Esrei, 99% the same text. Aleinu, 100% the same text. Okay. The order of services, which blessings come first, followed by the Psalms, followed by the Shacharit and the Shema and the Shemona Esrei, Aleinu, same thing. There's maybe a couple of little different things that are added in. So it's pretty much the same. Okay. The differences are on high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There you'll find differences, not in the structure of the service, but in primarily what we call, in Ashkenazi terms, liturgical poetry, otherwise known as piyutim in the Sephardic world. Okay, so when you have all of those extra prayers that you read on the high holidays, Untanet Tokef and this and that, so Ashkenazim and Sephardim have different ones of those. Okay, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about those too, because they point to an interesting, different experience of the tunes. You know, in the Ashkenazi tunes, I'll just say another thing. When you talk about a difference in tone, so when you say slichot, for example, right, on during the month of Elul or on Yom Kippur, when you say the penitentiary prayers, so one of the lines, okay, in the penitentiary prayers, which is common to both prayers, traditions, is the line in Hebrew, Chatanu lefanecha rachem aleinu. 4 words. Chatanu lefanecha, we have sinned before you. Rachem aleinu, have mercy on us, right? Right? Or like Avinu Malkeinu, you know that, right? Sephardim sing Avinu Malkeinu, Ashkenazim sing Avinu Malkeinu. Same lyrics. Tunes are different. Chatanu lefanecha rachem aleinu. When I went to Ashkenazi synagogues, when I go, it sounds something like this. It has a very dramatic, you know, European kind of orchestra and choir sound. Like you could hear the music and there's some like a drama that takes over and it goes, Chatanu lefanecha rachem aleinu. That's the typical Ashkenazi tone, right? In the Sephardic tune, it goes, Chatanu lefanecha rachem aleinu. You can almost dance to it. I don't know, maybe we were happier sinning in front of God or admitting that we were sinning. The words mean the same thing, but the liturgical tunes were never austere. They were a little bit more upbeat. You know, and then of course the translation, much like in Ashkenazi synagogues, it was customary to translate certain things to Yiddish. In Sephardic synagogues, it was customary to translate things into Arabic or into Ladino. For what purpose? To preserve the culture? No. So people understood what they were saying, just like you have English translation in your prayer book. So they had Ladino translation. Today, maybe you'll go to a Sephardic synagogue and they'll say, let's sing Ladino because I want the flavor of it. 100 years ago, it had nothing to do with flavor. It had to do with, I don't know Hebrew. Can somebody translate for me? I only speak Ladino. I don't know Hebrew. I only know Arabic. Can somebody please translate? I don't know Hebrew. Can somebody please translate? I only speak Yiddish. That's what the translations were then. Today, they changed into being like, you know, we want to preserve the culture. Even if you don't know Yiddish, Ladino, or Arabic, people say, that's cool. Let's keep it going. So, you know, those things are also important to know. Next time I'll do a little bit more on the prayers and, you know, kind of you'll see some of the different sounds and get to experience it. Any questions or comments before we wrap? Yes, see your hand up. Stephanie.
Hi. Thank you, first of all, for everything you just taught us. I was really impressed. Really, you said something about the idea of the Rosh Hashanah Seder that seems to be Sephardic. Um, I'll never forget, I just a little anecdote, when I was going to a movie during Passover, I understood that corn was something okay to eat if you were Sephardic. And think I have some Sephardic or Spanish roots. So I wasn't sure if I could get popcorn or not. And there in the audience was Rabbi Leader. And I said, is it true? It just happened to be at the movies. And I said, if I'm Sephardic, can I have popcorn? And he said, yeah, if you're Sephardic, you can eat corn. And I just would like you to talk a little bit of how there have been changes to the dietary practices during Passover. And if this is not the time, another time when you are discussing this.
Yeah, I'm going to make a note of it and discuss it because it's a long topic, but it's important to understand that, like, when you say, or if you're Sephardic, can you eat corn, or like, can you eat popcorn? For example, I'm Sephardic and I don't eat corn or beans on Passover. There's reasons, there are different Sephardic Jews, like I'd mentioned, different Sephardic communities. There's no such thing as a uniform Sephardic way of life. Like, there's no such thing as a uniform Ashkenazi way of life. Right. Different Ashkenazi, and I don't mean denominations, I mean different Ashkenazi communities. Hungarians, Lithuanians, and Poles had different, vibes of Judaism. They had different interpretations. Their rabbis saw the same biblical and Talmudic text and interpreted it differently, and those became customs of Polish Jews or Hungarian Jews or Lithuanian Jews. Okay, so the same thing happened with Moroccan Jews, or Jews from Turkey or Rhodes, or Jews from Salonika, or Jews from Algeria. They each had their own traditions. Many of their traditions have crossovers, but they're not all the same. Yes.
To just follow up on that. So you're trying to make today's discussion overall was customs and culture versus laws, and
correct.
And Jews are all together Jewish, and it's how they interpret their customs and their cultures that came later that made the differences in what we understand. Is that what your overall statement? Yeah, got it.
Yeah. Yes. And I'll touch on that more. I made a note of it to touch on it more the next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure. Any other comments or questions from anyone? Anybody else? Okay. So I want to wish everyone. Yes, I see your hand up, Cami.
I have a question. Yes, I'm curious if you could recommend a book on the Zohar. I'm surprised that there is no magic element, that came later, and that it was mainly just rituals, regular rituals. And so I wondered if you could recommend a book on interpreting the Zohar, and if there was any kind of weird, fun, kind of seance-y vibe that happened through the Zohar.
I mean, a lot of things happen through the Zohar. Is the Zohar itself a proponent of black magic? No. The Zohar is a mystical, the Zohar is a midrash. Just like you read the midrash, the Zohar is a midrash. It's a commentary to the Torah. It's a commentary to the 5 books of Moses. So, a great introduction that was written recently to the Zohar was by Art Green. He just wrote a great one. I mean, there's a fantastic translation of the Zohar, the Pritzker edition by, I can't remember his name, will come back to me. Oh, Daniel Matt, M-A-T-T. So those are really good modern, if you want to actually see a text of the Zohar and to see how they work, maybe buy 1 volume of the English translation with the commentary. The introduction to that series by Art Green has an excellent introduction to the Zohar and to its background. But of course, the Zohar had a lot of spin-offs. The Zohar took off, was authored in 13th century Spain, by probably more than Moshe de Leon, was authored by a variety of people, and he perhaps edited or brought it to publication, or, showed it to the world. But there were multiple commentaries to the Zohar that came much later, including the, seances and black magic and so on. But just to know that the seances originally were nothing more than, expanded versions of rabbinic laws on meditation before prayer. They weren't, black magic with incense and, the Bodhi tree on Melrose Avenue. They were like, it was what we did in synagogue. It was, the halacha of kavanah. How do you have kavanah before tefillah? So the Kabbalists believed that all mitzvot require kavanah. All mitzvot require meditation. You can't simply put on tefillin, you have to meditate on it. You can't eat an apple before you meditate on the blessing and the fact that God created the world and created apple trees and so on and so forth. And you have to recite all sorts of Kabbalistic meditational formulas. That came in the 16th century in Tzfat, largely again authored by Spanish Sephardic Jews of their origins, right? They're the ones who developed all these ideas. Some people took it to the black magic place and, what they called Kabbalistic practitioners, healing practices, recitation of certain verses. When you blend them together, it creates a healing or it creates a tikkun for this or that. This came, of course, later as the product. The Zohar in and of itself could maybe lend itself to those ideas, but it's not a book that, speaks to the dead or things of that nature. That came a lot later.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else, anyone? Anyone else? I see. Okay. I want to wish everyone a wonderful week. Thank you. Thank you for all your comments and questions. And if you have anything else that comes up, I think you were able to get my email through Rabbi Susan Annis, and I'm happy to take your questions and try to incorporate your ideas into my next classes. So I want to wish all of you Shavua Tov, a great week, or almost Shabbat Shalom, actually. And we'll see you, please God, next Wednesday. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was fabulous.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
Sure.